So this February, the theme for this month, which I mentioned last week here at the congregation, is widening the circle. And February is also Black History Month, as you know. And you probably can tell by the readings, and probably we should not make it a February thing and integrate our readings and our music every month, which to some extent we do. We could do better, but we do try and widen the circle of where we draw inspiration from in this congregation at UUCC. And today's service alludes to the story of EGBERT Ethelred Brown, who is one of our great circle wideners of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. He's a pioneer in the Unitarian Universalist movement. He founded congregations in both Jamaica and Harlem in New York City. However, his story illustrates just how difficult it can be to widen the circle when racism, prejudice, and a lack of institutional imagination trammel our best efforts. And I say it's a love story because his story is definitely a story of devotion and determination in the face of what must have seemed at times insurmountable odds. It's a story of faithfulness to hope when things look bleak. EGBERT Ethelred Brown was born in Jamaica in 1875. At the age of 32, he had a steady government job. He was trained as an accountant. He was married with children and was a regular churchgoer when at his uncle's house he stumbled across a sermon by the Unitarian William Ellery Channing. This was one of the great 19th century sermons. Reading about God being one and reading about the benefits of a rational religion, and Brown had always had questions growing up about everything from the Athanasian Creed to the miracle stories in the Bible. Brown decided he was a Unitarian. And not only that, he wanted to become a minister, which you don't need to do to be a Unitarian, but Brown had felt the calling to the ministry. And he sent a letter addressed to any Unitarian minister in New York City. I have to give credit to the Jamaican and U.S. Postal Services because that letter, addressed to any Unitarian minister in New York City, eventually found its way to the Reverend George Badger, a Unitarian minister, who passed it along to the president of Meadville Theological School, Franklin Southworth. I also went to Meadville many years after Reverend Brown. President Southworth was committed to, as he told it, solving the race problem. And so he was enthusiastic by this letter, and he invited Brown to attend the school and started to arrange scholarships, which were typical for all those entering the ministry to help them find their way. So Southworth was an early supporter, but this encouragement was not universal. Several Unitarians tried to dissuade EGBERT from entering the ministry, saying that as a black man, he was unlikely to ever find a parish to minister in. Now, it's important to stress that the Unitarians, by and large, even then, like to think of themselves as liberal, and most would say they were opposed to racism. But the prejudices of the age were as rife in the seminary as anywhere else. In those days, this was the early 1900s, fellow students would tell Ethelred Brown, "You must have some white blood in you," when he produced an impressive bit of scholarship. And there were other barriers as well. He had to delay seminary by a year because the first time he landed on these shores, he was deported by immigration officials because he had an offer of some work as an accountant, and they sent him back to Jamaica. So he had to wait a whole year. Many people, that would be the end of the journey, but Brown was undaunted, waited a year, worked in Jamaica, and came back the next year and was successful. In 1912, Reverend Brown was ordained and went to Jamaica as a Unitarian missionary. He received a little bit of funding to set up a church, but this funding came with the oversight of the American Unitarian Association, as it was then known, and with the occasional patronizing advice and criticism. They wondered why EGBERT was trying to found this church in Montego Bay, where he came from, rather than the main city of Kingston. They noted and lamented that there was prejudice in Jamaica, too. Reverend Brown had quite dark skin, and lighter-skinned Jamaicans could be hesitant to be led by someone of a darker hue. And when the church plant did not meet with immediate success, and most church plants don't, they started to withdraw funding. Of course, it typically takes many years to start a new endeavor like this, but the white leaders of the American Unitarian Association, who in principle, again, were against racism, were unwilling to put their collective pocketbooks where their mouths were. Reverend Brown made trips to Boston to persuade people. He wrote umpteen letters to the denomination, and most of these were unsuccessful. He pointed out that Jamaica had many new churches from other denominations, including historically black churches, that were much better funded, much better funded than the Unitarians. Would the Unitarians take a chance on him? But in short, they kept the strings close. After a year, they transferred him to Kingston, Jamaica, which basically meant he had to start all over again in a new city. And 18 months after that, they withdrew the funds. But EGBERT Brown did not easily give up. His efforts in Jamaica did not succeed, so in 1920, Reverend Brown moved to Harlem in New York City with the intention of starting a Unitarian church there. As you probably know, Harlem in the 20s was one of the most amazing places in the history of the world. During the Harlem Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston, Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, and Josephine Baker all lived in the same neighborhoods and inspired one another. Reverend Brown arrived in Harlem a month after Paul Robeson. He sparred intellectually with Marcus Garvey, whose views Brown disagreed with. It was in that great cultural mecca that Reverend Brown established the Harlem Unitarian Church. This time, the American Unitarian Association was not funding his ministry. While he worked tirelessly to build up a church, Brown worked 5 years as an elevator operator. Now, he was a qualified accountant, remember, but could not find employment in that line in America in the 1920s. And he said sometimes other Unitarians would not take him seriously because he worked in a blue-collar field. And I think that classism is still very much in operation sometimes in Unitarianism. He later worked as a speaker, professional speaker for the Socialist Party. And then he received condemnation for different reasons, for political and not class reasons. In spite of these challenges and many others, the Harlem Unitarian Church lasted from 1920 up until Reverend Brown's death in 1956. It was a remarkable institution. It was known as a temple and a forum. A temple because they did hold worship services there. It was a place of the Spirit. But the forum was equally important. Reverend Brown was keen on rationality and rational religion. And he criticized the black church and in large for often having a focus on the next world and ignoring social justice problems in this one, and the intellect and justice. And now that same criticism could be leveled at most white churches as well, of course. And Harlem Unitarian Church and its minister were devoted to discussing the pressing issues of the day, institutional and personal racial injustice, and Reverend Brown would often send off a letter when he saw a wrong that might be righted, capitalism and socialism and communism, war and peace, which of course was a big issue in the early part of the 20th century as it is today. Brown himself was a fervent debater, but democratic in his principles. At a forum where he spoke at length against Marcus Garvey, he then allowed his detractors the floor for 20 minutes, and then another 10, even as the atmosphere in the room became increasingly heated with the strongly opposing views. We can be a fractious bunch, us Unitarians. The Reverend Morrison Reed, the author of the biography which this is summarized from, paints a compelling portrait of EGBERT Brown. He was a far from perfect person. He wasn't trying to paint a perfect picture of a perfect person, because none of us are. Brown could be vain. He was opinionated, sometimes to the point of obstinacy. He was criticized for having expensive taste for his family, but that was probably unfair. He was criticized for putting his children in private school in Jamaica on the proceeds, but he wanted the best for them. And perhaps this was the only way to really get them in school as a preacher's kids. Brown did not have loads of charisma in a profession that could have made use of that. He was not a Howard Thurman or a Martin Luther King Jr. So he wasn't perfect, but one of the many pernicious aspects about racism and prejudice and all oppressions really is how a person will be punished for imperfections that would likely be overlooked or at least viewed as part of some greater total package in a less prejudiced system. In the 20th century, and I think still in the 21st, white people can be allowed to be quirky, to have flaws, and their better qualities may be stressed as they shine through. And that is not always the case, or was not the case for a black pioneer in a white denomination. And no one would deny that EGBERT Ethelred Brown was incredibly devoted to the cause, that he was deeply intelligent and astute, that he was faithful. My goodness, was he faithful through so many challenges in his life. Were he a white minister in our mostly white denomination, he would be lauded. But Brown was treated with suspicion and all too often dismissed as needy or a crank, even though he was one of our best hopes for integration. Brown was faithful to the cause of Unitarianism in Jamaica and Harlem at a terrible cost to his family. His wife suffered from mental trauma and could be found wandering the streets helpless at times. His eldest son committed suicide. Many observers noted that the stress in Reverend Brown's life, the amount of discouragement he faced and the effects of that on his family must have been at least a factor in the overall stress that his family faced. Now, on a personal level, it's worth hearing the story because the story of EGBERT Brown is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. How many of us have faced bumps on the road along the way, career setbacks, personal setbacks, even sometimes oppressions for some of us. And Brown never gave up. And because he never gave up, as the reading mentioned, Brown continually reminded the American Unitarian Association of the importance of Black America. On a wider level, it shows just how pernicious and how persistent the forces of racism and other oppressions can be in this country. Now, Reverend Brown was a minister in our supposedly progressive faith. If you ask Unitarians in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s what they thought about racism, most, not all, but most would have answered similarly to Unitarians today, I suspect. That is, most people would say that racism was bad and should be ended, that blacks and whites should live together in peace and have equal rights, and everyone else for that matter. But this lofty intention did not square entirely with the practicalities of actual life and the facts on the ground. Meaning well did not stop the Unitarian movement from being, at times, institutionally racist. And I think these kind of self-critical stories are important, not to guilt trip one another, but just so we take a good hard look at how racism and other oppressions really work.